You're listening to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, a podcast that explores what matters most to business. I'm your host, Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. Let's get talking. Fans of the show, and we do thank all of you, may remember that our very first episode way back in January featured Senate President James Coleman talking about his goals for the 2026 legislative session. And if you remember that, you may also remember that a particular goal he discussed was the introduction of a bill to allow for regulatory and rule review as a way to ensure that regulations being passed by the legislature are meeting their aims without overburdening state businesses. Well, on March 11th, Coleman, along with Senate Minority Leader Cleve Simpson, introduced Senate Bill 137, which would require each department of the state to review its rules at least every 5 years, present those reviews to legislative committees, and give committee members the opportunities to recommend an audit of some rules or a sunset review when they see fit. And with that bill likely to get its first committee hearing either this week or next week, we today are welcoming President Coleman back onto the show to discuss the effort in more depth. President Coleman, welcome back onto Colorado Chamber Office Hours.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, first, for those who missed the original conversation, explain why you're pushing for the ideas, the changes proposed in this bill.
Well, Senate Bill 137 is titled Measures to Reduce Administrative Burdens. First and foremost, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to run this bill with not only the Speaker of the House, but both House and Senate Minority Leaders, Senator Cleve Simpson and Representative Jarvis Caldwell. But the real intent of this policy is to look at measures that right now may be doing more harm than good to help not just businesses, but across the board in the state of Colorado, us be able to move forward and do really good work. And so I think as we're hearing from, in particular, businesses around our state about the challenge of being able to stay in Colorado or the challenge of being able to start a business or businesses want to move to Colorado, I think it was really important to be looked across the board at some of these administrative burdens, and I'm excited to work on this bill.
Now, I described what this bill would do at a high level, and of course we all understand that details are going to change, but in general, how do you imagine this working? How would a department go about looking at their regulations? What would happen from there?
So the bill creates consistency in the current rule review process. It removes the requirement for DORA to create a schedule of departmental review of rules, and alternatively, what it does is requires each department to establish their own schedule to review those rules in no less than 3 years. The bill improves the criteria to be considered when a rule is adopted, also to include whether rules are adopted that impact the department, that has same or similar purpose, whether the rule is outdated or obsolete. I think in the last conversation we had, we talked about some of the regulations or rules that things were important maybe in the 90s, maybe in the 80s, but something that's different today. Whether the agency has evaluated the economic and non-economic costs of the program or function on the state, whether funding levels are at the level to support the programs where appropriate, and then lastly, whether there are opportunities to improve the effectiveness of the rule in meeting its purpose and tender goal. I had a great conversation recently with some of our joint budget committee members, and we're trying to find ways to cut costs here at the state and provide resources to folks across the state. We also saw that there was costs within our departments. This might be another way to save some money by determining whether or not we need to continue to have these rules and regulations and those conversations around those. And so we're excited about something new, which is the potential to save the state money.
It's interesting. At a high level, it sounds like it's going to make legislators think more about the rules when they pass them and then make them rethink them after they've seen them in play for a little while. Intriguingly, it's not a bill that actually requires any type of regulatory rollbacks or regulatory reform, but just requires departments to consider the impacts of these new rules and legislators to consider whether those impacts match the intent of the bills they passed. With all that said, and said twice there, how much reform of existing rules do you think this bill will produce if it becomes law?
You know what? I'll tell you, if it didn't become a law, we never passed this bill, I don't think anything would change. And so I'm looking forward to seeing a significant impact, a significant change, and looking at those rules and potential rollbacks of some of those rules that even one for us to consider would be make an impact. And I think the people of Colorado, the folks who do the work, really want to make sure that we're considering how these rules and regulations impact them. And it's the least we could do to your point, Ed, is to have a conversation about this, look at the rules, and determine whether or not they still make sense. And then after that, subsequently, additional policy could determine whether or not we need to move forward and change some of the rules we have in our state.
I can only imagine that since you've been talking about this concept, you've probably heard stories, whether from business leaders or maybe even state agencies, about rules they'd like to take a look at in more depth. Are there any that stand out to you? Are there any rules that you think about or general categories of rules that you think could be really impacted by this?
I haven't spoken with any particular businesses about particular rules, but just them being able to come in and weigh in on what they think could be ideas to improve business. The beautiful thing about the legislature is that not all of us have owned a business, worked in a particular business, understand operations, but we get to bring in business leaders who do understand those things and inform and advise us on what could improve. So we're excited to hear some of those ideas and concerns they might have when they do come up once this is passed.
And are there particular folks that you envision doing the deep dives here? Is this going to involve, say, the state auditor's office, or is this mostly going to involve the departments themselves monitoring themselves?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a little bit of both. I'm excited to work with Director Patty Salazar and her team at the Department of Regulatory Agency just to better understand what are some of the things that we need to work on to improve our state when it comes to regulation. I think having her input with the bill draft and making sure that as this moves forward, both the auditor and businesses can weigh in and give perspective on what maybe needs to change. I'm not a big fan of businesses policing themselves, but I am a big fan of businesses weighing in and giving perspective on how this should work. And you know what? You do have some businesses that do really great work when it comes to supporting their staff, supporting their employees, when it comes to regulations. And those are the ones that have always said, James, we already do these things you're asking us for when it comes to regulation. And so it doesn't necessarily impact them, but it might impact somebody else that's not doing that work. So I'm going to be calling on those business leaders who are already doing good work to help us with this policy, help us once it's passed to be implemented, and make sure that we're bringing all other business leaders to the table that may need help when it comes to how we better operate as a state with our businesses.
Sounds like people who are listening to this ought to get some ideas going about what kind of rules they want the state to re-examine. I know there are plenty of people, including some in your party, who might blanch a little at the suggestion of regulatory reviews, concerned that it could lead to rollbacks of critical safety or critical health protections. How do you handle those conversations when people approach you with concerns like that?
Yeah, listen, I tell folks that I've been here for 10 years and I have voted in support of every single policy that our labor force says we really need to make sure that these things are helping us in terms of the work, being able to afford to do the work, being able to get paid for doing the work that they're doing, making sure that, their rights are being protected. And I will still continue to support those, right? Even the Labor Peace Act that passed last year that went to the governor's desk and didn't make it through the governor's desk is coming back this year. 100% of the Democratic caucus, both in the House and the Senate, voted yes on that bill. So for me, I think it's making sure that those folks know we're not leaving them, we're not forgetting about them, we're not changing our perspective. But what we are saying is we also know that those jobs don't exist without businesses, and we have to figure out, are there things we can all agree on that are not serving anyone well? There are folks who work in some of these companies that are enforcing, the regulations that need to be, and they don't agree with them either, right? But we don't know what those are until we sit down and have those conversations, what all of those are. So I'm excited about continuing to work and excited about this new component that's going to help our businesses be stronger.
And to that point, if this were to become law, what do you think will be different in 5 years about state rules and the rulemaking process? That's an open-ended question, but really I'm trying to put into perspective how much can change because of a bill like this.
I think that the people in the state of Colorado are going to further trust their government because their government's not just doing things they think are nice or things that are based off of emotion, that we've actually taken the time to sit down and do research and have data analysis and look at whether or not these regulations are benefiting them. I think, if nothing else, just appreciation for intentionality. And then what comes from that 5 years from now, I do hope, is we've identified, even sooner than that, we've identified those regulations that we realize now are not as beneficial as we thought they were, and that we can roll those back and find ways to, again, support our businesses here and encourage more businesses to come to Colorado.
Well, this is clearly the beginning of a conversation that starts with Senate Bill 137. Senate President James Coleman, thanks for sitting down and talking to us about your bill, which we will be following as it moves through the legislative process.
Thank you.
Now that you've got the policy overview from Senate President Coleman on what the regulatory and rule review bill would do, we want to do something a little different with the second interview this week. Because no one is registered in opposition to Senate Bill 137 at the time we're taping the show, we thought the second perspective this week should come from a business owner who can explain the impact of existing regulations and what exactly the effort to reconsider and review these regulations would mean to him and to his fellow employers. And to that end, I would like to welcome to the show Steve Swinney, the founder and CEO of Kodiak Building Partners, a Highlands Ranch-based building materials holding company. Swinney has been very active in the area of regulatory reform and recently co-authored an op-ed piece on the need for it with our own Colorado Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Lauren Furman. Welcome to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, Steve.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, first up, I gave a very short description of your company, but for listeners who don't know Kodiak, please tell us a little bit more about what the company does, how large it is, and why it's led you to be active in the public policy space.
Sure. So Kodiak Building Partners was started in 2011 right here in Colorado. Myself and a few folks I worked with started the company to really acquire and then operate building product distribution companies across the U.S. Today, we have about 110 locations around the country in 30 states. We did $2.5 billion in sales last year with about 5,500 employees around the country.
Okay, that puts this in good perspective here. Knowing that over the past 5 to 8 years, do you feel like the number of state regulations on your business have increased?
Yeah, they've definitely increased. And I would tell you, it's something that as a business owner and a leader, we don't track all the bills every day. We don't even know the names of most of them, but I can tell you we feel the impact of them.
In particular, are there regulations that have impacted your operational ability? Are there things that the state has done that's made you do things differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we've seen over the last several years has just been the impact on all the day-to-day aspects of what we do. I mean, we're moving a lot of heavy material every day into our warehouses and then out onto job sites. And so, when you think about the increased reporting, that's the big one, all the tracking of things. Most of these regulations aren't actually bringing a new task to the table that accomplishes something. It's really mostly about reporting to the state to prove that we're doing things for our employees. So whether that's in safety, labor, go to the permitting and job site dynamic of getting new homes out of the ground, which is so needed in our state. All of these things the sad thing is they're all about just reporting, or most of them seem to be, to those of us on my side of the table. And so what it means is that we're shifting labor from, GDP producing activities to moving paper.
I was going to say, and practically, what's that meant to your operations? Yeah. Are you having to do less business because you don't have the resources to pay attention to customer needs?
Well, here's what I think it means. Initially, what it typically means is more expense. It means you got to hire someone to do that report, or you've got to hire more people because now part of their job has to be reallocated to that kind of reporting. What happens in the longer run, though, is that it changes the whole economic environment of the state, and it just creates less jobs and less work, which then means there's just less demand for what we do. If you look at two of our operating companies that we acquired very early in Kodiak's journey, one of those was the first company that we acquired, Barton Supply, back in 2011, right in Aurora, and then Jones Hart's in 2013, I think, was when Jones joined us. If you look at those two companies, and they're fantastic operating companies, so they do good work. They should be growing. If you look at those two businesses, they created about 200 jobs in the state of Colorado between 2011 and 2017. Since 2017, they've lost about 60 jobs. And that's because the demand is no longer there for the service, partly because of this regulatory environment. And as a result, we have less jobs. That's bad news for the state.
Now, it's good to know that you are operating on a national basis. Are you seeing similar things nationally, or is Colorado an island for what it's doing regulatorily?
No, I think that's the other thing. And it's, one of the things that's very interesting about our business and my job is getting to see that perspective across the country. And it's frankly one of the reasons that we've gotten so involved in the Colorado Chamber and just in this whole dynamic of what needs to happen in Colorado. when you go all the way back to us starting the company, one of the things that we thought about was where should we be growing our business? And so we looked at demographic trends. We looked at what states were growing in population and why they were growing. And then we looked for opportunities to get into business there. When we started, there were 3 places we really wanted to be: Colorado, our home state, Florida, and Texas. During the course of the first 6 years of our journey, we were able to get into each of those states, and we saw great job producing business climates in each of those states that were really providing a terrific tailwind for business. When I look at the last 8 years since 2017, those other 2 states, they've continued that, and we've continued to grow in those states. When I look at Colorado, sadly, we've seen a deterioration of that growth and then really a real pullback. And so we've seen a real divergence from places like Colorado to Texas and Florida, for example.
So what do you think a bill like Senate Bill 137 might do to help your company then?
Well, so listen, I think this bill is such a common sense thing, whether it's in our government or my business, or frankly, just at our homes when we're trying to run our households every day. There's inherently things that, you do, you build a new report at your company, or doing a new analysis, and it's to solve a problem. And then over time, there's other problems you got to solve. And so you do some more. And at some point along the way, a lot of times those problems you were trying to solve, they're not there anymore. Or that tool does nothing to solve that anymore. And I think it's no different in government. And so what I think we see happening right now is just new regulations each year, sometimes very similar to something in the past that's just a twist on that. And so the opportunity for the state to start taking some workload off the state and then off of businesses that need to comply with those rules is really transformational. It starts shifting that change I talked about earlier that has occurred over the last several years. And instead of it being a headwind to business growth and job creation, we can start to actually free up the private sector to create new jobs for Coloradans to have a better life.
Now, Senate President Coleman said he's not going to hand the keys over to business to run this process, but he said he does want to hear from business about what kind of regulations, if this passes, do we need to review. What would you tell him?
I think one of the filters I would ask to have in there is what problem are we solving for Coloradans with this regulation? Not what report are we getting, what data are we getting, but what problem are we actually solving? And I think you start with that question. I have a feeling we'd sunset a lot of these regulations right out of the gates.
Any in particular, or any area in particular? Does the state need to look at some of its public safety regulations, some of its paid leave regulations?
I think you could pick any of those areas, but I'll pick on family right now. Family, I believe, was the solution to a problem that we didn't have. You look at our company. We're all about our employees and their families. We love family growth. We were just talking before this interview about families, and we already had a very good leave policy that we did for maternity leave for working moms who were having a baby, and fathers, by the way, as well. Family came along, and in order for us to just navigate the system of that, we are doing a lot of work to provide the same benefit to our employees that we were already doing without family. In addition to all the complications of trying to navigate how to best implement that, I will tell you that it's become incredibly confusing to our employees. We just did an employee survey, and one of the really interesting things that came out in commentary of our Colorado-based employees was they don't even understand what benefit they're getting any longer. They used to. It was very cut and dried. You're going to have a baby. Here's what we're going to do, and we wish you well, and we're going to have a baby shower for you before you go off for a couple months, and here's your benefits. What I saw in this survey was several people not even understanding what benefit we provide to them. And the reason is that when they get when they sit down to go through their maternity leave, it's so complicated for us to explain to them that, well, you're going to get this from family, and then you're going to get this from short-term disability, and then you're going to get this from the company. And it's confusing to them. They can't understand it. And I don't blame them, because I've been through it multiple times and I can't understand it. So I just think that is one that I think is, and it's like a lot of these regulations, well intentioned to begin with, but not actually solving a problem that's really making life better for people in our state.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym, FAMILY is the Family and Medical Leave Insurance Program that was passed by voters in 2020 and enacted in 2023 that allows up to 12 partially paid weeks of leave for every employee in this state who has maternal needs or a sick family member, a number of things. We could go on and on for a whole episode on that. But to wrap up this episode, I want to ask you, obviously, even passage of this bill would not mean that regulations would go away. But do you think that passing it could even on its face send a message that Colorado is a little more open, a little bit more friendly to business?
Well, I think it would. I mean, this is one of the easiest measures to look at how friendly a state is to do business in, is to look at the regulatory environment. That's so I think it would be a great headline and a great start for us. But I think hopefully the next step in that is that we start thinking about government being a place to really create an environment for job creation. That's what we really want, is for us to create an environment that's really friendly to creating jobs for people. When you create jobs, you create more opportunities for people. And by the way, I think you create an impetus for businesses to need to be better for their employees. When there's a plentiful job market, it's tough competition to get great people. And so what do? You want to create a better environment for people to work in. When we're restricting job growth, which all these regulations do, we're creating an environment that kills jobs. And when we kill jobs, businesses have much more plentiful workforce to go to. They're less incented to make a great environment for people. So, I mean, let's have our government be about job creation, which is going to ripple down to great job environments for employees, which is going to ripple to great families in Colorado and great opportunities for the future.
Steve Swinney, founder and CEO of Kodiak Building Partners. Thanks for digging into this subject with us on Colorado Chamber Office Hours.
Thanks so much.
That's it for our interview segment. Now let's take a quick look at what you need to know about the week ahead. All right, we've got another big week ahead. And let me start by telling you what's not coming, and that is the bill we just spent 20 minutes discussing. Yes, I know it's a little strange, but legislative leaders were at one time considering holding the first hearing for Senate Bill 137 this week. However, they ultimately decided to put it on the calendar for March 31st instead. So consider yourself informed well in advance of your first hearing on this bill if you'd like to reach out to your senator and express your opinion. Now let's talk about what actually is coming. First up, on Monday afternoon, the House Finance Committee will finally hear the fourth of four bills that is part of its tax reform package. House Bill 1289 makes a large number of modifications to the state tax code, but the most consequential of them is its provision that changes what is known as the 80-20 rule in a way that would require international companies to include overseas profits in the revenue that determines the amount of taxes they will pay to Colorado. Business groups like the Colorado Chamber are seeking amendments to this bill, which is up at 1:30 p.m. in House Committee Room 112. On Tuesday morning, the House Health and Human Services Committee will consider House Bill 1327. This bill would establish a first-in-the-nation requirement that large employers with a significant number of part-time workers receiving Medicaid or SNAP benefits would have to pay a portion of the benefits given to those workers. Sponsors say it is about corporate accountability, while opponents like the Colorado Chamber say this could incentivize employers to eliminate part-time positions for workers who are seeking more limited hours. The bill is scheduled fourth on the upon adjournment agenda in House Committee Room 112. On Wednesday morning, upon adjournment, the House Education Committee will take up House Bill 1317. This bill would consolidate all of the state's workforce development and higher education programs into one new department in order that these now siloed efforts can work together better for both the students seeking job training and the employers looking to partner with the state on training programs and curricula. Business groups like the Colorado Chamber support this bill as employers continue to cite skilled talent shortages as one of the biggest obstacles to growing in this state. The hearing is scheduled in House Committee Room 107. On Wednesday afternoon, the House Health and Human Services Committee will try for a second time to hear House Bill 1267, which limits the ways that hospitals and healthcare providers can collect debt. Business groups like the Colorado Chamber oppose this bill, particularly as 70% of hospitals in the state continue to report operating with unsustainable margins. The hearing is scheduled third on the agenda in House Committee Room 112. And finally, Thursday brings to the calendar the first hearing for Senate Bill 138, a regulatory reform bill aimed specifically at the healthcare sector, seeking to repeal a number of rules that sponsors say are administratively burdensome for providers but do little to nothing to increase patient safety. The bill is scheduled 6th on the agenda in the old Supreme Court chambers. That's all for this episode of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. Once again, I'm Ed Seelover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. I'll keep the conversation going at tsscolorado.com, and we'll see you next time as we explore the issues that matter most to business.